Recording now. Hello, and welcome to the National Policy Group webinar on an introduction to Alabama Senate Bill 384. This webinar has an audio and a video component. If you cannot see or cannot hear part of the presentation, please refer back to your call-in instructions in the email and try again. In the course of this webinar, you will not be able to speak to the presenter. Should you have any questions, please submit them through the webinar portal. All questions will be addressed at the end of the webinar. The webinar will be recorded for your convenience. If you miss something or see something that you want to go back to, we will reproduce this and distribute it later after the webinar. We won't edit anything, we won't change anything, so what you see and what you hear will be exactly what you get when you go back and refer to the webinar. This webinar is for informational purposes only and does not constitute legal advice. If you have any questions about the law in Alabama or the application of this legislation to your practice, please seek the advice of a qualified attorney or other legal professional. I will be your presenter today. My name is Mark Guymond. I am a registered federal lobbyist. I am also a registered state lobbyist. I've had the opportunity to testify before the United States Congress and 43 state legislatures. Some of the work that we've done recently for the profession and industry of acupuncture was the 2013 legislative summary. This was a review of all of the legislation nationwide that was introduced that was relevant to the practice of acupuncture. And then we also did the state law summary in January of 2014. This had its genesis as a project for acupuncture students. We had some information from students who were receiving their education in a particular state and then thought perhaps that they might want to practice in a different state. And people were having confusion about what statutes to look up, where do they go, how do they go to someplace else to find out what they need to do to practice. So we put together a comprehensive analysis of all of the state laws, and we distilled that information down into things such as what is the definition of acupuncture, what is the scope of practice, what are the prohibitions, what are the restrictions, what are the education requirements, continuing education requirements, who is the enforcement authority, even down to where to get the application online or get a renewal online and what the fees are for a license. So it's a very good tool for a student. It's also a great tool for a practitioner to review what the state law is in a home state, or if you're thinking about going to some other state. What we found was the state law summary was also an excellent tool for state legislators, and we'll see this later on in the discussion why this is important. But it was a good way for legislators in one state to have an easy review to see what other states were doing, what their law was versus somebody else's, and compare and contrast that easily in a document that makes sense. Okay, so this brings us to the subject matter at hand. It's extremely important. The legislation in Alabama is Senate Bill 384, and it was just introduced literally just days ago. It's important to understand what the existing law is in relationship to this legislation to see why this is important. The existing law in Alabama is that there are no requirements authorizing the licensure or regulation of acupuncture or Oriental medicine. What's key to understand this is there are no requirements authorizing the licensure, meaning there's no law that permits one to practice acupuncture, except for an opinion letter that was issued by the Medical Licensure Commissioner, which says that acupuncture may be practiced by a licensed physician. So, in essence, Alabama law says unless you are a licensed physician, you may not practice acupuncture, regardless of your training, your skills, any of that. So Alabama's law is essentially an outright prohibition for anybody but a licensed physician. So that brings us then to the substance of Alabama Senate Bill 384. The bill itself was introduced on February 20th, and it is currently in the Senate Health Committee. It was sponsored by Senator Allen. This is his contact information and where to reach him. If you're in the state or even outside and you have an interest in, this is the contact information where you want to touch base with him. Okay, so what does the legislation do? The summary of the legislation, the official summary, states that the bill is relating to acupuncture, and it establishes the Alabama Board of Acupuncture and Oriental Medicine, and it provides for the licensing and regulation of the practice of acupuncture. Now, in the bill itself, the official language of the bill, it says that the bill would establish the Board of Medicine and grant licensure to practice acupuncture and Oriental medicine. The bill provides for the board, so the board has to have a composition, it has to have functions, it has to be stated what that board is going to do in terms of its legal functioning. So, let us look then to what we're talking about. What are the definitions in the bill? What does this bill apply to, and to whom and how? The first definition that we have is acupuncture itself. And I'll give you a moment to read this on your own, and I'll come back to you in a second. Okay, so we have a very good starting point here for what the definition of acupuncture is. We go to the next slide, and the definition continues. It continues with what is this, well, essentially the scope of practice of the definition. So acupuncture has the first slide and the slide, and I'll give you a moment to review this as well. I'll come right back to you. Okay, so this is a very straightforward bill. Acupuncture is pretty clear. It doesn't include things like physician assistance, chiropractic, any of that. It pretty much is straightforward only to acupuncture. We look to what an acupuncturist is. It's one who's practicing acupuncture as previously defined. And we look at the board, and the board is what is going to constitute the Board of Acupuncture and Oriental Medicine. So what does the bill do? First, it creates the board. The board has the authority to essentially be the end-all for the entire practice. They can implement the act, and they administer the act. This is it. The board will do it all. That's it. The board is going to have 4 members to it. 3 of those will hold valid certifications from the NCCOM or otherwise be licensed to practice acupuncture, and the 4th member shall be a member of the public. Ostensibly, I would take that to be the 4th member is not a member of either the industry or the practice of acupuncture, that they would be completely outside, just a consumer or concerned party. The board is going to have to reflect the diversity of the state. And the first initial board will have 2 2-year terms and 2 4-year terms for the members. Upon the expiration of those terms, the governor will appoint additional people, as is the proper form done in the state. The law also contains a sunset provision. Let me take a moment to discuss what a sunset provision is before I go into what it actually does. Sunset provision is an expiration date of a law. Some states have this, and it says that on a date certain, this law will expire. It will no longer exist. This bill in particular for this law, has a sunset provision of October 1st, 2016. So we're looking at this law going into effect hopefully soon, but then it will expire on October 1st, 2016. So while the advocacy effort needs to be put into place now to get this law put into place, immediately then the advocacy has to start right thereafter to make sure that as of October 1st, 2016, that the law does not expire again. The law will actually have to be renewed prior to October 1st, 2016. So that renewal could occur either in the 2015 or even the 2016 legislative sessions. Of course, waiting until 2016, there's always a chance that if the bill did not pass in that legislative session, that the law would expire and acupuncture would go back to being essentially illegal as a profession except for licensed physicians. So it's extremely important for everybody to be concerned not only about what's happening with this law immediately, but what is happening immediately after its implementation and enactment. There's also a provision in the bill which says essentially if you die, retire, or have a disability, that you can get your license fees back. If we go to what does the board do? The board, as I said, has sweeping authority over the entire practice. So what does that mean? It means that the board will have the authority over approval, renewal, denial, restriction, revocation, and suspension of licenses. That is essentially the beginning, middle, and end of the entire process. The board also has to promulgate, meaning create, and publish rules for these certain elements right here. I'd like to skip over 1 for a moment and just go to 2, 3, and 4. 2, 3, and 4 are probably pretty straightforward. Rules for the licensing procedures, how are they going to take applications, how are they going to approve them, minimum competency requirements, educational standards, and minimum standards of practice. Those seem pretty straightforward. Number 1 is the area that I'd like to focus attention for just a moment, and that is the Code of Ethics. The board has to promulgate and publish rules for this Code of Ethics, but the statute would not provide any guidance as to what that Code of Ethics says or does. As we'll learn later on, this could have very dire implications for a practitioner in terms of compliance with the law. But until that Code of Ethics is defined, it could be extremely problematic. So anybody that's concerned with practice in Alabama will want to watch those rules in particular very, very carefully, because that Code of Ethics could define not only the standards of practice for being an acupuncturist itself, but it also could have related business aspects, how it is that you actually conduct the business of acupuncture. All right, so let's look then to some of the requirements and prohibitions in the bill, things that it says that you must do or must not do or cannot do. If you're going to engage in acupuncture using needles to pierce the skin, so on and so forth, you first need to make an application. You cannot just obtain your license out of the blue. You have to make an application. That application has to be reviewed, and you have to be granted a license. So then you have to have the license. You have to have a valid license before you can practice. You can't just simply put in your application and hope that it goes through. You must have first obtained a valid license. Otherwise, it is unlawful and a violation of the Act to practice acupuncture. So you actually have to have that license in full. It has to be issued from the state before you can practice. All right, looking at the license renewal and continuing education requirements, licenses will renew annually, and the board has the authority to provide for a continuing education requirement as a condition of renewal. The license itself, the board has the authority to require a competency exam. In this case, the competency exam has 2 options that are available under the bill itself. The first is an exam administered by the NCCAOM or administered by the board. Administered by the board meaning probably created by the board to their standards, and then actually having the board test to that accreditation. My thought is the board is probably not going to have enough time in its initial setup and initial round of licensing to have an exam that they create and administer, so it may default back to the NCCOM immediately for the at least for the short term. To obtain a license, you have to meet these minimum requirements. You have to be at least 21 years of age, of good moral character. I'm going to skip over number 3 for a moment, come back to it. And then number 4, you have to have an active certification from the NCCAOM or an equivalent organization as recognized and approved by the board. Much like the certification examination, I'm not sure that the board is going to have time in its initial startup phase to recognize and approve additional certifications, but it is certainly at their discretion to do so. Reverting back, if I may, now to number 3, these are the exemptions under subsection C. Subsection C, in turn, is essentially a reciprocity arrangement. If you hold a license in another state, and you are 21 years of age, and you have good moral character, and you've not had any disciplinary actions against your license, if your license is similar to and meets the criteria and standards of Alabama, Alabama will recognize and give you reciprocity for your existing license. Now, when we were speaking of the state law summary at the very beginning of the webinar, this is a document that you may want to use and have available if you are out of state and want to go into Alabama. The state law summary would give you an easy reference to say, here are the elements of my state law, here are the elements of Alabama state law, and then just match the 2 of them. It's something that you would give to the regulators and have really an authoritative reference guide so that they don't have to go out and try to figure it out on their own. Having worked with state regulators for many, many years, I know that they would be appreciative of that and would recognize the effort that you put in to make it easier on them. This essentially says that if the board goes through an examination of their own, they can charge a fee. which takes us into what are the fees? What is this license going to do? How much is it going to cost you? What is the bottom line? The bottom line is the initial license, applications and license, has a maximum of $600, and the renewals will be up to $200. And of course, the board can charge for the examination as they choose. My expectation is that the application and license fee initially will be very close, if not at the $600 ceiling. Given the limited number of practitioners in the state and the universe that could be there, they're going to have to cover their costs immediately with a small group of practitioners. As that group of practitioners grows over time, that license fee may go down, but my expectation is it will probably start very close to the ceiling. This takes us into some of the things that you can and cannot do as a matter of having your license. You cannot engage in fraud or deception in the effort to procure your license or pass the exam. You have to fulfill the continuing education requirements if and or when they are mandated by the board. You can't pretend to be another practitioner or use somebody else's license. And number 4, again going back to violation of the code of ethics adopted by the board, is very important. Because these may be practices that are not only, again, the practice of acupuncture itself, but potentially these could also be the business of acupuncture. What are the things surrounding the practice? Conviction of a felony, endangering the welfare of a patient, if you've been adjudicated as mentally incompetent, and I'm going to skip over number 8 for a moment, or you engage in an act that exceeds the scope of practice. Those are all violations of the Act. Now, it's also a violation of the Act for engaging in any willful or negligent violation of the Act itself, obviously, or the rules adopted thereof. If you go back to something like the Code of Ethics, the Code of Ethics may have standards for business practices, but not for practice of acupuncture. But if you violate those, even negligently, it doesn't have to be willful, deliberate, it doesn't have to be knowing. There's also the negligent. If you're negligent in a violation of the Act or the rules, including the Code of Ethics, you violate the Act. So you want to be very careful in knowing what that Code of Ethics says when it does get finalized. The board also has the authority to recognize certain specializations in the practice of acupuncture, and the board has the authority to designate titles. I'd like to take a moment here and say that the board may designate appropriate titles, including but not limited to, meaning the board has the authority by this bill, if it became law, to use this listing of titles as well as the abbreviations. But it's not limited to that. This is the starting point. They can exceed that. So if the board had other titles or abbreviations that they wanted to use, this allows them to go above and beyond that. This is the requirement that if you have a patient whose condition is not improving or requires emergency medical treatment, you shall promptly consult with a physician. I think that's pretty straightforward. Okay, so this bill is sitting out there and may become law. Let's assume for a moment that it does. What is the effective date? When do you need to be concerned? This act shall take effect on the first day after the 3rd month following its passage and approval by the governor. Okay, what this means essentially is whenever it happens, whenever it's approved, the governor signs it, the next month, the first day of that next month, plus 3 months, is the effective date. And there's not really a great concern on the effective date itself. So if this became signed by the governor at the end of March, went into effect, April 1st was the first day, and then we have 3 months of May, June, July. Say it's July 1st, it's the effective date of this law. That's not really the trigger date of concern to you. Your concern is the time from enactment to the time of enforcement. So the key measure that you have to be concerned with is that effective July 1st, 2015, a person may not practice acupuncture unless he or she holds a valid license issued by the board. That is the area of concern that everybody should have. This is the practitioner concern right here. So between the time of the effective date and the enactment of this law, the governor has to appoint a board. The composition of that board has to be established. The board has to come up with an application, go through application procedures, go through approval of applications, and issue licenses. And in that time as well, issue all the rules that go along with that. So whenever this passes, say we have a July 1st, 2014 enactment date, then the effective date of July 1st is simply a year later. So 1 year after this law goes into effect, this board is going to have to do all this work. So they're going to be extremely busy. But this is the date that if you are practicing after July 1st without a license, you'll be in violation of the Act. So that is really that's the killer for everybody. That's what you need to be concerned with. I think that pretty much does it for that. The penalties, if you are violating the Act, it's a Class C misdemeanor. Part of the concern, too, is the board has the authority to go for injunctive proceedings against a practitioner as well. The board can seek restitution of $2,000, attorney's fees, and court costs. One of the things that's noteworthy in this, though, is the action for injunctive relief is not by a judge. It is not a trial by jury. It's not a jury of your peers. So it would be pretty much an administrative proceeding. Best advice is just don't get to that point. Look for that July 1st, 2015 effective date and follow that. So as we go through this bill, we need to look at what can we do now? Why is this important? Well, time is of the essence. This bill was introduced on February 20th. We are here just several days later reviewing it, and the Alabama legislative session is expected to adjourn on or about April 30th. It's not a date specific, but that's probably the best guess for everybody right now. That means between today and April 30th, the bill needs to move, pass through the Senate, pass through the House, be signed by the governor, and be done. It's a very short period of time, but state legislation has a tendency to move very quickly. I've seen bills literally move in 2-3 weeks, and that's the entire lifespan of the bill. So that's what you're looking at in terms of the immediacy of action, is the legislative session will adjourn on April 30th or thereabout, and everything needs to be completed by that point if it's going to happen in 2014. So I'd like to thank you for joining us for this webinar on an introduction to Alabama Senate Bill 384. If you have any questions at this point, please feel free to submit them through the portal in the webinar, and I'll be right back with you to address those. Okay, it doesn't appear that we have any questions, so I'm going to take that as a good sign. I appreciate you joining me for this. Again, my name is Mark Guyman. I was the presenter in this. If you have any follow-up questions, feel free to submit them to me at info@nationalpolicygroup.com, and we will do our best to get those questions answered and give you whatever you need. Thank you for your attendance.